The camera blinked in the corner of Ethan's room, its tiny red light a silent betrayer in the dark. He didn't know it was there, didn't know his father's paranoia had burrowed so deep it could violate the one space Ethan thought was his own. At 22, Ethan Caldwell was still learning how to breathe in a world that felt like it was holding its breath around him. San Francisco pulsed outside his window, the city's heartbeat a steady rhythm of freedom and chaos. Ethan had moved here 3 years ago, fleeing the suffocating marble halls of his father's Manhattan penthouse. Richard Caldwell, tech billionaire and master of control, had built an empire on surveillance software, but Ethan never imagined that empire would turn its gaze on him. He thought he'd escaped, thought the distance would shield him from his father's unyielding expectations. He was wrong. Tonight, Ethan sat cross-legged on his bed, his sketchbook open to a half-finished drawing of a man's face. Sharp jawline, warm brown eyes, a smile that felt like home. Javier. The name alone sent a shiver through him, a mix of longing and fear. They'd met 2 months ago at a community art class in the Mission District, where Javier's bold strokes and quiet confidence had drawn Ethan in like a moth to a flame. Javier was everything Ethan wasn't. Open, unapologetic, a Mexican-American artist who wore his identity like a badge of honor. Ethan, with his pale skin and inherited wealth, felt like a ghost beside him, always hiding, always afraid. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, and Ethan's heart leaped. A text from Javier. Meet me at the cafe on Valencia Street. 7 p.m. Bring your sketchbook. Ethan's fingers trembled as he typed a reply, his mind racing. He'd never told Javier about his family, about the weight of being Richard Caldwell's only son. He hadn't told anyone he was gay, not his father, not his old prep school friends, not even himself until last year. The truth was a fragile thing, and Ethan wasn't sure he was strong enough to hold it. He stood, catching his reflection in the mirror. Dark hair fell into his eyes, and his worn denim jacket felt like armor against the world. He grabbed his sketchbook and headed out, unaware that the camera above his desk was recording every move, every hesitant smile, every step toward a life he was only beginning to claim. The cafe was a warm glow against the cool September evening, its windows fogged with steam and laughter spilling out each time the door opened. Ethan spotted Javier immediately, leaning against the counter with a coffee in hand, his dark curls catching the light. Javier's presence was magnetic, drawing eyes from across the room, but he only had eyes for Ethan. You're late, Javier teased, his voice low and playful as he slid into a booth across from Ethan. I got lost in a sketch, Ethan lied, his cheeks flushing. He didn't mention the 20 minutes he'd spent pacing his apartment, convincing himself not to cancel. Javier's smile softened, and he reached across the table, his fingers brushing Ethan's wrist. The touch was electric, grounding, terrifying. Ethan pulled back instinctively, his eyes darting around the cafe. What if someone saw? What if his father's world reached even here? Relax, Javier said, his voice steady. You're safe with me. Ethan wanted to believe him, wanted to lean into the warmth of those words, but the weight of his father's shadow was heavy. He didn't know that shadow was watching, that Richard Caldwell sat in his Manhattan office, staring at a live feed of his son's room, his jaw tight with suspicion. Richard had installed the camera a month ago. After Ethan's late-night calls grew shorter, his visits home rarer. Richard told himself it was for Ethan's safety, that San Francisco was a dangerous city for a young man with a trust fund. But deep down, it was control. Richard had built his fortune on knowing everything, every line of code, every competitor's move, every secret his employees thought they could hide. His son would be no exception. Back in the cafe, Ethan opened his sketchbook, showing Javier the drawing he'd been working on. It was Javier, captured in charcoal, his eyes alive with a spark Ethan couldn't replicate in himself. This is incredible, Javier said, his voice soft with awe. You see me, Ethan. Really see me. Ethan's throat tightened. No one had ever said that to him before. No one had ever looked at him the way Javier did, like he was more than a name, more than a legacy. As they talked, the cafe faded away, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he could breathe. They spoke of art, of dreams, of the worlds they wanted to create. Javier shared stories of growing up in Oakland, of his mother's tamales and his father's quiet pride when he won his first art contest. Ethan listened, hungry for a life that felt real, unscripted. He didn't tell Javier about the camera, about the father who saw his every move as a potential failure. He didn't tell him because, for one night, he wanted to be free. But freedom was an illusion. Across the country, Richard Caldwell leaned closer to his screen, his eyes narrowing as he watched the empty room. Ethan's absence gnawed at him, a puzzle he couldn't solve. Where was his son? Who was he with? Richard's fingers hovered over his keyboard, ready to dig deeper, to tighten the leash. He didn't know that what he'd see next would unravel everything he thought he knew about his son and himself. The night stretched on, and Ethan walked Javier home through the mission's vibrant streets, murals glowing under streetlights. They stopped outside Javier's apartment, a modest building with chipped paint and a flickering porch light. "Come to my next art show," Javier said, his voice earnest. "I want you there." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. He wanted to say more, to confess the feelings that burned in his chest, but the words stayed locked inside. Javier stepped closer, his breath warm against Ethan's cheek. "You don't have to hide," he whispered. "Not from me." Ethan froze, torn between running and staying. He didn't know that his father's camera had captured the sketchbook left open on his bed, Javier's face staring up at the lens. He didn't know that Richard was already making calls, hiring investigators to find out who this man was, what he meant to his son. Ethan only knew that, for the first time, he felt seen, and it was both the most beautiful and terrifying thing he'd ever known. Ethan woke to the soft hum of San Francisco's morning fog, the city draped in a gray veil outside his window. His sketchbook lay open on his desk, Javier's portrait staring back at him, a reminder of last night's warmth. He could still feel the ghost of Javier's breath on his cheek, the words "you don't have to hide" echoing in his mind like a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He didn't know his father had seen the sketch. Richard Caldwell sat in his Manhattan office, the city skyline a cold backdrop to the storm brewing inside him. The camera feed had shown him the drawing, the unmistakable intimacy in the lines of Javier's face. Richard's investigators had already dug up a name. Javier Morales, 24, an artist with no wealth, no connections, no place in the world Richard had built for his son. To Richard, Javier was a threat, a deviation from the plan. Ethan was supposed to marry well, take over Caldwell Technologies, carry the legacy, not chase some painter in a city that reeked of rebellion. Ethan's phone buzzed with a new message from Javier. "Art shows tomorrow. Still coming?" A smile tugged at Ethan's lips, but it faltered as he glanced at the mirror. The weight of his father's expectations pressed against his chest, heavier than ever. He typed a quick "wouldn't miss it" and headed out, unaware that his father's investigators were already tailing him, their car idling a block away. The Mission District was alive with color as Ethan walked to Javier's studio, a small space tucked above a taqueria. The air smelled of fresh paint and warm tortillas, and Ethan felt a pang of envy for the life Javier had carved out. Simple, honest, his own. Javier greeted him at the door, his smile bright enough to cut through the fog. "You're early," he said, pulling Ethan inside. The studio was a chaos of canvases, each one bold and unapologetic, just like Javier. Ethan's sketches felt timid in comparison, but Javier never made him feel small. They spent the afternoon preparing for the show, hanging paintings and laughing over spilled coffee. Javier's touch was casual but deliberate, a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a brush of fingers as they passed a canvas. Each contact sent Ethan's heart racing, a mix of desire and dread. He wanted to lean in, to close the distance, but the fear of being seen, of being known, held him back. He didn't know that a private investigator was snapping photos from across the street, capturing every moment for Richard's scrutiny. In Manhattan, Richard's office was a fortress of glass and steel, but he felt anything but secure. The photos arrived by email, showing Ethan laughing, touching, lingering too long near this Javier Morales. Richard's jaw clenched. He'd raised Ethan to be perfect, to follow the path laid out for him. This wasn't part of the plan. He called his head of security, a man named Victor who moved like a shadow. "Find out everything about Morales," Richard ordered. "I want to know what he's after." Victor nodded, but his eyes held a flicker of unease. He'd worked for Richard for a decade, seen the man's ruthlessness in boardrooms and beyond. But spying on his own son felt different, darker. Victor didn't say it, but he wondered if Richard was chasing a truth he wasn't ready to face. Back in San Francisco, the art show was a burst of life. The gallery was small but packed, with locals and artists mingling under string lights. Javier's paintings glowed on the walls, vibrant abstracts and tender portraits, each one a piece of his soul. Ethan stood in a corner, clutching a glass of cheap wine, his eyes fixed on Javier as he charmed the crowd. Javier caught his gaze and winked, and for a moment, Ethan forgot the world outside this room. Then his phone rang. It was his father. Ethan's stomach dropped as he stepped outside, the cool air hitting him like a warning. "Ethan," Richard's voice was clipped, controlled. "We need to talk. Come home this weekend." Ethan's throat tightened. He hadn't been back to New York in months, hadn't faced his father's cold scrutiny since Christmas. "I'm busy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't a request," Richard snapped. "You're my son. You don't get to disappear." The call ended before Ethan could argue, leaving him staring at the phone, his hands shaking. He didn't know his father had seen him with Javier, didn't know the camera in his room was still watching, capturing the way he clutched Javier's portrait when he returned home that night. Javier found him later, sitting on the gallery steps, his face pale. "You okay?" Javier asked, sitting close enough that their shoulders brushed. Ethan wanted to tell him everything. About the camera he didn't know existed, about the father who saw love as a weakness. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he leaned into Javier's warmth, letting the silence speak for him. Across the country, Richard stared at the latest camera feed, his son's head resting on Javier's shoulder as they sat on Ethan's bed, talking softly. Richard's hands clenched into fists. He didn't understand what he was seeing, didn't want to. But he couldn't look away. Something in Ethan's eyes, something alive, something real, stirred a memory Richard had buried long ago. A memory of a boy he'd once loved, a boy he'd let go to build the empire that now defined him. He pushed the thought away, but it lingered, a crack in the armor he'd worn for decades. Ethan, oblivious to the storm brewing, felt Javier's hand slip into his. "Stay tonight," Javier said, his voice soft but firm. Ethan's heart pounded. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. For the first time, he felt like he was choosing his own life. But choices have consequences, and Ethan's were about to collide with his father's obsession in ways neither could predict. Ethan's suitcase sat by the door, a reluctant sentinel for the trip he dreaded. New York loomed like a guillotine, his father's summons a blade waiting to fall. He hadn't told Javier about the call, hadn't told him how Richard's voice had sliced through the fragile courage Ethan had built in San Francisco. The camera in his room blinked on, unnoticed, as Ethan paced, his sketchbook clutched like a lifeline. Javier's portrait was tucked inside, a secret Ethan couldn't bear to leave behind. He'd spent the night at Javier's, their first night together, not in passion but in quiet intimacy, talking until dawn, their hands intertwined, their breaths sinking in the dark. It was the closest Ethan had ever felt to whole, and now he was being pulled back to a world that wanted to break him apart. In Manhattan, Richard Caldwell was unraveling. The camera feed had shown him more than he could process. Ethan's laughter, his vulnerability, the way he looked at Javier like he was the only thing that mattered. Richard's investigators had delivered a dossier on Javier. No criminal record, no hidden motives, just a young man chasing his art with a fierceness Richard envied. It didn't make sense. Richard had expected a con artist, someone after Ethan's trust fund. Instead, he saw love, and it terrified him. He called Victor into his office. "I want Morales gone," Richard said, his voice low, dangerous. "Pay him off, scare him off, I don't care. Just make sure he's out of Ethan's life." Victor nodded, but his silence was heavy. He'd seen the footage too, seen the way Ethan came alive around Javier. For the first time, Victor questioned his loyalty to Richard. But orders were orders, and he had a job to do. Ethan's flight landed at JFK under a gray sky, the city's skyline a jagged reminder of his father's power. The Caldwell penthouse was as cold as he remembered, marble floors, modern art worth millions, and a silence that screamed control. Richard greeted him with a stiff nod, his eyes scanning Ethan like a machine searching for flaws. "You've been distant," Richard said, pouring himself a scotch. "What's keeping you in San Francisco?" Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to lie, to say it was just the city, the freedom. But the truth clawed at him, desperate to be free. "I'm building a life," he said, his voice steady despite the fear. "I'm happy there." Richard's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, gesturing for Ethan to sit. Dinner was a tense affair, each word a landmine. Richard asked about Ethan's studies, his plans, but never about his heart. Ethan answered carefully, his mind on Javier, on the warmth waiting for him back in San Francisco. That night, in his childhood bedroom, Ethan felt the walls closing in. The camera wasn't here. Richard hadn't dared install one in his own home, but the weight of his father's gaze was just as heavy. Ethan pulled out his phone, texting Javier, "Miss you. This place feels like a cage." Javier's reply came instantly, "You're stronger than you think. Come back to me." Ethan smiled, but the ache in his chest grew. He didn't know Victor was already on a plane to San Francisco, a check in his pocket and a threat on his lips. The next morning, Javier was in his studio, preparing for a new commission, when Victor knocked. The man's presence was jarring. Suit too sharp, eyes too cold for the mission's warmth. "Javier Morales?" Victor asked, stepping inside without invitation. Javier nodded, wary. Victor slid an envelope across the table. $50,000, he said. "Leave Ethan Caldwell alone, and it's yours." Javier's stomach churned. He'd known Ethan came from money, but this was something else, something dark. "I'm not for sale," Javier said, pushing the envelope back. His voice was calm, but his hands shook with anger. Victor leaned closer, his tone icy. "You don't want to make an enemy of Richard Caldwell. Walk away, or you'll regret it." Javier stood his ground, his eyes blazing. "Ethan's worth more than your boss's money. Tell him that." Victor left without another word, but the threat lingered, a shadow Javier couldn't shake. Back in New York, Ethan sat through another day of his father's probing questions, each one a test he wasn't sure he could pass. Richard was distracted, checking his phone, his mind clearly elsewhere. Ethan didn't know about Victor's visit to Javier, didn't know his father was planning to tighten the noose. But he felt it, the suffocating sense that his freedom was slipping away. That night, Ethan slipped out of the penthouse, needing air, needing space. He wandered to Central Park, the city's lights a distant hum. He called Javier, his voice breaking as he confessed how trapped he felt. "I don't know how to do this," Ethan said, tears stinging his eyes. "I don't know how to be me and his son at the same time." Javier's voice was steady, grounding. "You don't have to choose, Ethan. You just have to be honest. Start with yourself." Ethan hung up, his heart pounding with a new resolve. He didn't know that Richard was watching the camera feed from San Francisco, catching the moment Ethan returned to his apartment later that week, Javier waiting for him with open arms. The sight of them together, Ethan's head buried in Javier's chest, Javier's hands gentle in his hair, sent Richard into a rage he couldn't name. He didn't understand why it hurt, why it felt like losing something he'd never admitted he wanted. But he wasn't ready to let go, not yet. Ethan's return to San Francisco felt like stepping out of a storm. The city's fog wrapped around him like a shield, and Javier's apartment was a sanctuary. They sat on the couch, a single lamp casting soft shadows, Javier's hand resting on Ethan's knee. "You survived," Javier said, his smile teasing but warm. Ethan laughed, the sound fragile but real. He didn't tell Javier about the weight of his father's gaze, the way Richard's silence had felt like a verdict. He didn't know about Victor's visit, about the envelope Javier had refused. The camera in Ethan's apartment was still watching, its lens cold and unyielding. Richard sat in his office, the feed playing on a monitor he couldn't turn away from. Ethan's laughter, his ease with Javier, was a language Richard didn't speak. He saw his son's smile, genuine, unguarded, and it stirred something he'd buried decades ago. A memory of a boy in college, A boy with kind eyes and a laugh that made Richard feel alive. A boy he'd pushed away to chase ambition, to build the empire that now felt like a cage. Richard's fingers hovered over his phone. He wanted to call Victor, to demand results, but doubt gnawed at him. What was he trying to protect? Ethan, or the version of Ethan he'd created in his mind? He didn't know that Victor was already back in San Francisco, watching Javier's studio, waiting for an opportunity to press harder. Ethan and Javier spent the day painting, their brushes moving in tandem on a shared canvas. It was a mural for the community center, a burst of color celebrating resilience. Ethan's strokes were hesitant at first, but Javier's encouragement steadied him. "You've got this," Javier said, his hand guiding Ethan's. The touch lingered, and Ethan didn't pull away. For the first time, he let himself feel the warmth without fear, let himself believe he could belong here, with Javier, in this life. But outside, Victor was closing in. He'd learned Javier's routine: early mornings at the studio, late nights at the community center. He waited until Javier was alone, locking up the center after a youth art class. "You didn't take the money," Victor said, stepping out of the shadows. Javier froze, his keys jangling in his hand. "I told you. I'm not leaving, Ethan," he said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. Victor's eyes were cold, but his voice softened, almost pleading. "You don't understand what you're up against. Richard Caldwell doesn't lose." Javier squared his shoulders. "Neither do I." He walked away, leaving Victor in the dark, but the encounter left him shaken. He didn't tell Ethan, didn't want to burden him with the truth. But he felt the walls closing in, the weight of a billionaire's power pressing against their fragile world. In New York, Richard's doubt grew into a storm. The camera feed showed Ethan happier than he'd ever been, but it also showed a truth Richard wasn't ready to face. He called a board member, an old friend named Margaret who'd known him before the empire. "Am I wrong about this?" he asked, his voice raw. Margaret sighed. "You're watching your son live, Richard. Really live. What are you so afraid of?" He didn't answer, couldn't. The memory of that college boy, Michael, flashed again, sharper now. Richard had loved him once, in secret, before choosing power over feeling. He'd never forgiven himself. Ethan, unaware of his father's turmoil, felt a shift in himself. He and Javier went to a queer open mic night, a small venue packed with poets and singers sharing their truths. Ethan had never been to a place like this, where people wore their identities like art. Javier convinced him to read a poem he'd written, a quiet piece about hiding and being found. The crowd's applause was a wave, washing away years of shame. Javier's hand found his under the table, and Ethan didn't let go. But the camera saw it all. Richard watched as Ethan read, his voice trembling but strong. He saw the way Javier looked at Ethan, the way Ethan leaned into him. It was undeniable, and it broke something in Richard. He called Victor, his voice shaking. "Stop," he said. "No more threats. Just watch them. Report back." Victor nodded, but he was done following orders blindly. He'd seen enough to know Ethan wasn't the problem, Richard was. The next day, Ethan and Javier walked through Dolores Park, the city sprawling below them. Ethan felt bold, reckless. He stopped, turned to Javier, and kissed him under the open sky. It was quick, tentative, but it felt like a revolution. Javier grinned, pulling him close. "Took you long enough," he teased. Ethan laughed, but his heart raced. He didn't know Victor was watching from a distance, his camera clicking, or that those photos would soon land on Richard's desk, forcing a reckoning neither father nor son was ready for. Ethan's kiss lingered in the air, a quiet rebellion against the fear that had held him for so long. Dolores Park buzzed around him and Javier, oblivious to the seismic shift in Ethan's world. For the first time, he felt like he could claim his own heart, but the weight of his father's shadow loomed, unseen but ever present. In New York, Richard stared at the photos Victor had sent. Ethan and Javier, hands intertwined, lips meeting under a San Francisco sky. The images were a knife, cutting through decades of denial. Richard remembered Michael's laugh, the way they'd walked through campus at night, stealing moments before Richard chose ambition over love. He'd told himself it was necessary, that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now, Seeing Ethan's courage, he wondered if he'd been wrong all along. He didn't call Victor. Instead, he booked a flight to San Francisco. He needed to see Ethan to understand what he'd missed. The camera feed still played on his monitor, showing Ethan sketching in his apartment, Javier beside him, their laughter a melody Richard couldn't comprehend. He felt like an intruder in his son's life, and the realization stung. Ethan, unaware of his father's impending arrival, threw himself into his art. Javier had convinced him to submit a piece to a local gallery, a portrait of Javier painted in bold, unapologetic colors. The process was freeing, each stroke a step toward the person Ethan wanted to be. But doubt crept in at night. When he was alone in his apartment, the camera's red light blinking like a warning he couldn't see. He texted Javier, "What if I'm not enough?" Javier's reply was instant. "You're more than enough. You're everything." The gallery opening was a whirlwind. Ethan's painting hung among others, its vibrancy drawing whispers from the crowd. Javier stood beside him, proud, his hand brushing Ethan's in a quiet promise. Ethan felt exposed, but not afraid. He was starting to believe he could live openly, that love didn't have to be a secret. He didn't know Richard was landing at SFO, didn't know Victor had sent one last report. They're happy. Let them be. Richard's arrival in San Francisco was unannounced. He didn't go to Ethan's apartment, didn't want to face the camera he'd installed. Instead, he went to the gallery, drawn by a flyer he'd found online. The crowd parted as he entered, his presence commanding even in a city that didn't know his name. He saw Ethan before Ethan saw him, standing tall beside Javier, his face alight with a confidence Richard had never seen. The painting caught his eye, Javier, captured in colors that screamed life. Richard's chest tightened. This was his son, not the shadow he'd tried to mold. Ethan froze when he saw his father. The gallery's warmth turned cold, and Javier's hand tightened around his. "Dad." Ethan's voice was barely audible, a mix of shock and fear. Richard stepped closer, his eyes flicking to Javier, then back to Ethan. "I saw your painting," Richard said, his voice softer than Ethan had ever heard. "It's remarkable." The words were a lifeline, but Ethan didn't trust them. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice shaking. Richard hesitated, the weight of his mistakes pressing down. "I needed to see you," he said. "Really see you." Javier stepped forward, protective but calm. "He's not alone," Javier said, his voice firm. Richard nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. He didn't mention the camera, didn't confess the violation. Not yet. The night stretched on, awkward but charged with possibility. Richard stayed, watching Ethan move through the crowd, his pride warring with his guilt. He saw the way Javier grounded Ethan, the way they fit together. It was a mirror to what he'd lost with Michael, and it hurt more than he'd expected. When the gallery closed, Richard asked Ethan to walk with him. Javier stayed behind, giving them space but watching closely. They walked to the Embarcadero, the bay glittering under the stars. "I've made mistakes," Richard said, his voice raw. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself." Ethan stopped, his heart pounding. He wanted to ask about the camera, about the years of control, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he said, "I'm gay, Dad. And I love him." The confession hung between them, a truth Richard had seen but never heard. Richard nodded, his eyes distant. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." He didn't mention the camera, but the guilt was there, a shadow Ethan couldn't yet see. They stood in silence, the city's hum a backdrop to a moment neither could fully grasp. Ethan felt a crack in the wall between them, small but real. He didn't know if it was enough, but it was a start. The San Francisco night was alive, but Ethan felt like he was standing still. His father's words, "I know," echoed in his mind, both a relief and a wound. He walked back to Javier's apartment, the city's lights blurring through unshed tears. Richard had returned to his hotel, promising to talk more tomorrow, but Ethan wasn't sure what that meant. He didn't know about the camera, didn't know his father's confession was only half the truth. Javier was waiting, his door opened before Ethan could knock. "You okay?" he asked, pulling Ethan into a hug. Ethan nodded, but his silence spoke louder. They sat on the couch, Javier's hand a steady anchor. "He didn't yell," Ethan said finally. "He didn't try to fix me. That's new." Javier smiled, but his eyes were wary. He hadn't told Ethan about Victor's visit, about the threat still hanging over them. He wanted to protect this moment, this fragile hope. In his hotel, Richard couldn't sleep. The camera feed was accessible on his phone, but he didn't open it. For the first time, it felt wrong, like a line he couldn't cross again. He thought of Michael, of the letters he'd burned, the life he'd chosen to bury. He thought of Ethan's painting, the way it captured Javier's soul. Richard had built an empire on control, but he was starting to see its cost. He called Victor, his voice heavy. "Destroy the footage," he said. "All of it." Victor hesitated. "You sure?" he asked. Richard's silence was answer enough. The next morning, Ethan and Javier met Richard at a cafe in the Castro. The rainbow flags outside felt like a challenge, a reminder of the world Richard had never understood. Ethan was nervous, his fingers tapping against his coffee cup. Javier sat close, his presence a quiet strength. Richard looked older in the morning light, the lines on his face deeper, his eyes softer. "I was wrong," he said, the words clumsy but sincere. "I thought I could control your life, make it what I wanted. But you're not me." Ethan's breath caught. He wanted to believe his father, wanted to trust the vulnerability in his eyes. But years of silence, of judgment, didn't vanish in a single conversation. "Why now?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp. "What changed?" Richard hesitated, the camera's existence burning in his chest. He couldn't confess, not yet. "I saw your art," he said instead. "I saw you, and I remembered someone I lost." The words hung heavy, a truth Richard hadn't spoken in decades. Ethan didn't push, but he felt the weight of something unsaid. Javier's hand found his under the table, grounding him. They talked for hours, tentative steps toward understanding. Richard asked about Javier's art, about their life in San Francisco. He listened, really listened, for the first time. Ethan felt a spark of hope, but it was fragile, easily crushed. Victor, meanwhile, was erasing the camera's footage, file by file. But he kept one copy, a failsafe he didn't fully understand. He'd worked for Richard too long to trust change, even when it seemed real. He didn't tell Richard, didn't tell anyone. The secret was his now, a burden he wasn't sure he could carry. That evening, Ethan and Javier walked through the Mission, the city's energy wrapping around them. Ethan felt lighter, but the weight of his father's past still pressed against him. "Do you think he means it?" he asked Javier, his voice soft. Javier stopped, turning to face him. "I think he's trying," he said. "But it's on him to prove it. You don't owe him anything." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. Javier saw him, all of him, and didn't flinch. They ended the night at the community center, helping kids paint a new mural. Ethan's brush moved with a confidence he hadn't felt before, each stroke a declaration of his own existence. Javier watched, his smile proud. They didn't know Richard was watching too, from a distance, standing outside the center's window. He saw Ethan's laughter, the way he guided a child's hand, the way Javier's presence made him shine. Richard's throat tightened. He'd spent years building walls, but Ethan was building bridges. Back at his hotel, Richard made a decision. He called his lawyer, drafting changes to Ethan's trust fund, removing the strings he'd attached. He didn't tell Ethan, didn't want to buy his forgiveness. He just wanted his son to be free. But the camera's secret still lingered, a truth he couldn't face. He didn't know that Victor's copy of the footage was about to change everything, that the past was never truly erased. Ethan stood in his apartment, the morning light filtering through the blinds, unaware that the camera's red light had gone dark. Richard had ordered it disconnected, but the damage was done. Victor's copy of the footage sat on a USB drive, a ticking bomb in his apartment across town. Ethan didn't know, couldn't know, that his life was about to unravel in ways he'd never imagined. He and Javier were planning a trip to Oakland to visit Javier's family. The thought of meeting them, warm, open, unburdened by wealth, filled Ethan with both excitement and dread. He wanted to belong, to be part of something real, but the shadow of his father's world still lingered. Richard had returned to New York, leaving promises of change, but Ethan wasn't sure he could trust them. Not yet. In Manhattan, Richard was trying to rebuild. He met with Margaret again, confessing pieces of his past. Michael, the love he'd buried. the fear that had driven him to control Ethan. "You can't undo the past," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "But you can choose now." Richard nodded, his hands trembling as he signed the papers freeing Ethan's trust fund. He wanted to call Ethan, to tell him, but the camera's secret stopped him. He couldn't face his son until he faced himself. Victor, meanwhile, was wrestling with his own conscience. The USB drive burned a hole in his pocket, a reminder of the line he'd crossed. He'd always followed orders, but this felt different. He'd seen Ethan's joy, Javier's defiance, Richard's slow awakening. He didn't want to be the villain in their story, but he didn't know how to be anything else. On impulse, he mailed the drive to Ethan's apartment, anonymous, with a note, "You deserve the truth." The package arrived while Ethan and Javier were in Oakland. Javier's mother welcomed Ethan with a hug that felt like home, her kitchen filled with the scent of mole and laughter. Ethan watched Javier with his siblings, their ease a stark contrast to his own fractured family. He felt like an outsider, but Javier's hand in his made him believe he could belong. They stayed late, sharing stories under the stars, and Ethan felt a piece of himself heal. Back in San Francisco, Ethan found the package on his doorstep. The note sent a chill through him, and when he plugged the drive into his laptop, his world stopped. The footage played, weeks of his life, his moments with Javier, his sketches, his tears, all captured by a camera he'd never seen. His hands shook as he realized what it meant. His father. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he'd ever felt. Javier held him as he cried, his own anger simmering. "He had no right," Javier said, his voice tight. "But you're stronger than this, Ethan. You've always been." Ethan wasn't sure he believed it, but Javier's certainty was a lifeline. They watched the footage together, every moment a violation, but also a testament to their love. Ethan saw himself through the camera's lens, scared, but growing, becoming someone he was proud of. He called Richard, his voice steady despite the rage. "Why?" he demanded. Richard's silence was deafening. Then came the confession. "I was afraid," Richard said, his voice breaking. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of you being like me." He told Ethan about Michael, about the love he'd buried. The camera a desperate attempt to keep Ethan close. "I was wrong," Richard said. "I'm so sorry." Ethan hung up, his heart a tangle of pain and pity. He didn't forgive his father, not yet, but he understood something new. Richard wasn't a monster, just a man broken by his own choices. Ethan looked at Javier, at the life they were building, and made a choice of his own. He deleted the footage, not for his father, but for himself. He didn't want to carry that weight. Months later, Ethan's art was gaining recognition, his paintings a vibrant declaration of his truth. Javier was by his side, their love a quiet strength. Richard visited, tentative, respectful, learning to listen. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but he showed up, and that was a start. The camera was gone, but its shadow lingered, a reminder of the cost of control and the power of truth. Ethan stood in a gallery, his latest painting unveiled, a portrait of himself and Javier, hands entwined, faces alight with hope. Richard was there, in the crowd, his eyes wet with pride and regret. He saw his son, really saw him, and for the first time, he understood what love could be. Ethan didn't need his father's empire, didn't need his approval. He had Javier, his art, his truth, and that was enough.